The story broke suddenly, framed as a whisper carried out of darkness and into the public eye, and people reacted because it struck at the most intimate space imaginable. According to a dramatized reconstruction based on alleged accounts, Romy Reiner described a moment that occurred late in the night, long before headlines, sirens, or investigators entered the picture. It was a moment so small it could have disappeared into memory, yet so heavy it reshaped everything that followed. She said Nick came to her quietly, not frantic, not visibly angry, but strangely calm, as if the world around him had already begun to recede. That Romy's voice, as retold in this narrative, did not focus on action but on tone. She emphasized that what unsettled her most was not what Nick said at first, but how he said it. His voice was low, steady, almost detached, as though emotion had been flattened into something hollow. She remembered thinking that he sounded exhausted rather than agitated, like someone who had reached the end of a long internal argument. That impression lingered with her, long after the words themselves began to echo that I in this dramatized telling. Nick allegedly leaned close enough that only she could hear him, and whispered something that made no immediate sense. It was not a confession. It was not an apology. It was not even a threat. It was a sentence that sounded unfinished, as if part of a larger thought he could no longer hold together. Romy later said that at the time, she dismissed it as meaningless, the kind of strange remark people sometimes make when they're overtired or emotionally drained. What gave the whisper its power was hindsight. After everything collapsed, after the night fractured into before and after, those words took on weight they did not originally carry. Romy described replaying the moment again and again, each time hearing something new in his tone. Not rage, not cruelty, but resignation, as if he believed something irreversible had already been set in motion. That I end this reconstructed account. Romy said she asked Nick what he meant. He did not answer directly. Instead, he repeated himself, more quietly, almost to himself rather than to her. That repetition, she later said, frightened her more than the words themselves. It suggested that he was not seeking understanding, but confirmation, as though he needed to hear the sentence exist outside his own mind. She recalled that he avoided eye contact. His gaze drifted past her, unfocused, like he was looking through the room rather than at it. In that moment, she said, she felt a strange disconnect, the sense that her brother was physically present but emotionally elsewhere. Still, nothing in his behavior triggered alarm. There was no shouting, no visible distress, nothing that resembled the warning signs people expect to see before catastrophe. Romy said she responded instinctively, telling him to get some rest, to sleep, to talk in the morning. He nodded almost obediently and stepped back. The interaction lasted less than a minute that would later stretch into something unbearable. When he walked away, she assumed the moment had passed. She assumed normalcy would resume. That assumption, she later said, became her greatest torment in the days that followed. As events were reconstructed and narratives formed, the whisper returned to her with relentless clarity. Words that once sounded abstract began to align with reality in ways she could not escape. She questioned herself endlessly. Should she have pressed him? Should she have raised an alarm? Should she have recognized the weight hidden beneath the quiet delivery? In this dramatized account, Romy emphasized that what haunted her was not a sense of missed heroism, but the realization that danger does not always announce itself with volume. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in calm, disguised as fatigue, cloaked in familiarity. The whisper was terrifying not because it was violent, but because it was ambiguous. It did not demand action. It invited dismissal. As the story spread, audiences reacted viscerally. People were not fixated on the words themselves, but on the idea that such a pivotal moment could occur unnoticed. The whisper became a symbol of everything people fear about proximity, about how well we truly know those closest to us. It challenged the belief that love automatically grants insight. That Romy's account, as framed in this narrative, was not presented as certainty, but as memory filtered through trauma. She acknowledged that memory bends under shock, that meaning is often assigned retroactively. Still, she insisted that the emotional truth remained. There was something final in his voice, something that felt like an ending disguised as a passing thought. The world reacted because the story forced a confrontation with uncomfortable questions. How many moments like that are ignored every day? How often do people mistake quiet withdrawal for harmless introspection? How easily do we normalize strangeness when it comes from someone familiar? The whisper in this telling was not evidence. It was not proof. It was a warning that only revealed itself after the fact. And that is what made it terrifying. Not because it explained what happened, but because it showed how little explanation sometimes exists before everything changes. After Romy shared that moment, the story did not move forward in a straight line. It widened. People began examining the idea of a whisper itself, how something so small could sit at the center of something so devastating. In this dramatized reconstruction, Romy said the hardest part was not remembering the words, but remembering how ordinary everything felt immediately afterward. Nothing shattered. Nothing screamed. The house did not change its posture. The night continued as nights usually do. She described how memory works differently after trauma. Details that once felt insignificant grow sharp edges. The tone of a voice becomes louder than the words. A pause stretches longer than it actually lasted. Romy said that when she replayed the moment, she noticed how Nick's breathing sounded controlled, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to keep themselves steady rather than someone losing control. That detail unsettled her deeply. I in this account. Romy reflected on how often families translate unease into excuses. Fatigue becomes the explanation. Stress becomes the answer. Silence becomes privacy. She admitted that she did exactly that. She told herself that Nick was tired, overwhelmed, worn down by circumstances she did not fully understand. The whisper fit neatly into that explanation, so she allowed it to pass. What followed, according to this narrative, was a long internal reckoning. Romy questioned not just that moment, but every interaction that came before it. She wondered whether the whisper was a final thread in a fabric that had been quietly unraveling for some time. Not violently, not obviously, just gradually thinning until it could no longer hold. She spoke about the danger of familiarity. When behavior changes slowly, it rarely sets off alarms. People adapt. They adjust expectations. They lower their threshold for concern. Romy said she realized too late how easily love can become a blindfold, how protecting someone's dignity can unintentionally protect their isolation. The story resonated because it was not about a dramatic confrontation. It was about ambiguity. The whisper was terrifying because it did not demand interpretation. It invited dismissal. It did not sound like an ending. It sounded like a fragment. In fragments, Romy said, are easy to ignore. I in this dramatized retelling. She described the hours after the whisper as deceptively calm. There was no sense of urgency, no instinct to call someone, no reason, at least on the surface, to intervene. That normalcy became unbearable in retrospect. It was proof that catastrophe does not always announce itself. Sometimes it waits quietly for assumption to do the work. As the account spread, psychologists and commentators began weighing in, not on the specifics of the words, but on the pattern they represented. They spoke about how people in emotional free fall often test reality with partial statements, not confessions, not plans, just fragments released to see if anyone reacts. The reaction, or lack of one, can shape what happens next. Romy said that realization haunted her. She wondered whether Nick was looking for interruption, for resistance, for someone to say, stop, this isn't okay. Instead, she offered reassurance, rest, mourning, normalcy. She did what most people would do in the absence of obvious danger to in this narrative. Romy was careful not to frame herself as a missed savior. She rejected that framing outright. She said the weight she carried was not guilt, but grief mixed with clarity. The clarity that whispers matter. That tone matters. That emotional exhaustion can sometimes hide something far more dangerous than anger. Public reaction deepened as people projected their own memories onto the story. Many recalled moments they had brushed aside, comments they had minimized, silences they had respected without question. The whisper became a mirror rather than a mystery. It reflected how easily people learn to live around discomfort instead of addressing it. Romy also spoke about how language fails in moments like these. She said no headline could capture the reality of that night. No quote could explain how ordinary the moment felt. The whisper did not sound cinematic. It sounded tired. That ordinariness was what made it so devastating later. In the dramatized account, she said the most painful realization came when she understood that the whisper was not about her at all. It was about him, about something he had already decided internally, whether consciously or not. The whisper was not a question. It was an echo. The world reacted with fear because the story dismantled a comforting myth. The myth that danger always looks dangerous. The myth that intuition will always scream when something is wrong. Sometimes, Romy said, intuition only murmurs, and people are taught to ignore murmurs in favor of proof. She finished recounting that moment. She returned to the same thought again and again. If there is one lesson, it is not to treat quiet as harmless by default. Silence can be a language. Exhaustion can be a signal. And whispers, however unclear, deserve attention. As the account continued to circulate, the whisper began to change shape in the public imagination, not because new facts emerged, but because people began to understand how trauma reshapes memory. In this dramatized narrative, Romy explained that she could not separate the moment itself from what followed. The past did not stay still. It shifted under the weight of outcome. What once felt vague became sharp. What once felt harmless began to feel heavy. She described how the mind searches for anchors after catastrophe. It grabs onto moments that feel pivotal, even if they were unremarkable at the time. The whisper became one of those anchors. Not because it explained anything clearly, but because it was the last interaction that felt close, intimate, and unguarded. That intimacy, she said, made it impossible to dismiss afterward. In recounting the night, Romy emphasized the setting. The house was quiet, familiar, wrapped in routine. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, no sense of crisis. That context mattered because it shaped how the whisper was received. In a different setting, the same words might have felt alarming. In that setting, they felt like fatigue talking. She said she remembered standing still after Nick walked away, listening to the silence return. The moment did not demand attention. It did not disrupt the rhythm of the night. That was its danger. It fit too easily into the background. She resumed what she had been doing. Life, for a brief moment, continued. In this retelling, Romy spoke about how the brain protects itself by normalizing uncertainty. When something does not fit, people often smooth it out rather than confront it. They fill gaps with assumptions. They tell themselves stories that preserve calm. The whisper was smoothed out that way. It became nothing more than a tired comment, filed away and forgotten. After everything happened, that filing system collapsed. The mind reopened the drawer and found the fragment waiting there, unchanged but newly illuminated. Romy said that illumination was brutal. It felt like betrayal by memory itself. The same moment could not be re-experienced the same way twice. Once innocence was gone, interpretation took over. She also addressed the pressure that followed. As the story gained attention, people wanted the whisper to be definitive. They wanted it to be a clue, a confession, a clear warning. Romy resisted that framing. She said the truth was more unsettling. The whisper was incomplete. It did not resolve into meaning. It simply existed. That incompleteness was what terrified people. It suggested that moments of consequence do not always arrive with clarity. Sometimes they arrive as fragments, and fragments require interpretation. Interpretation depends on context, emotional state, and expectation. In that moment, the expectation was normalcy. Romy reflected on how family dynamics complicate perception. When someone you love says something strange, the instinct is to protect them, to protect the relationship, to protect the peace. Questioning feels like accusation. Alarm feels like betrayal. Silencio feels kinder. She said she chose kindness, not knowing what it would cost that I end this dramatized account. She was careful not to assign blame to herself or others. She said the danger lies in believing that individuals alone can carry responsibility for recognizing collapse. Emotional breakdowns are complex. They do not belong to a single moment or a single listener. They are the result of layers, pressures, and internal battles invisible to outsiders. Still, the whisper lingered because it represented proximity. It happened close enough to matter, yet quietly enough to be ignored. That combination unsettled people because it mirrored their own experiences. Many recognized similar moments in their lives, comments they brushed aside, silences they respected, intuitions they overruled with logic. Experts who commented on the narrative noted that people in distress often communicate indirectly. They test the environment with partial truths, ambiguous statements, or quiet disclosures. These are not always conscious cries for help. Sometimes they are attempts to see whether the world will push back. The response, or lack of one, can shape what follows. Romy said she did not know whether the whisper was such a test. She refused to speculate. What she knew was how it felt afterward. It felt like a door closing quietly without a sound. Not slammed, not locked, just closed. As the story continued to spread, it became less about Nick and more about recognition. Recognition that danger can be subtle. Recognition that love can blur perception. Recognition that silence is not neutral. The whisper became a symbol not of guilt, but of fragility. Romy ended this part of her account with a reflection rather than a conclusion. She said that if there was anything to take from the experience, it was the importance of staying curious when something feels slightly off, even if it feels inconvenient or uncomfortable. Not every whisper leads to tragedy, she said, but every tragedy is preceded by moments that once seemed small. The power of the story lay not in revelation, but in restraint. It did not offer answers. It offered awareness. And that awareness lingered long after the words faded, leaving people with questions they could not easily dismiss. As the narrative deepened, Romy began speaking less about the words themselves and more about the emotional atmosphere that surrounded that night. In this dramatized reconstruction, she said the whisper could not be understood in isolation. It belonged to a larger feeling that something had been slowly tightening for a long time, something no one could quite name. The house felt heavy, she said, not tense, just weighted, as if conversations were being held underwater. She described how Nick had seemed distant in the days leading up to that night, but not in a way that raised alarms. He was present, polite, functioning. He spoke when spoken to. He smiled at the right moments. That surface normality, Romy said, made it easier to overlook what was happening beneath it. When people meet expectations, even minimally, concern often dissolves. In this retelling, Romy reflected on how families learn to live with unspoken discomfort. Over time, it becomes part of the environment like background noise. You stop noticing it because acknowledging it would require change, confrontation, or fear. The whisper, she said, was not an interruption of that pattern. It was a continuation of it. She recalled that after Nick walked away, she stood alone and felt an impulse to follow him, to ask another question, to insist on clarity. That impulse passed quickly. It felt intrusive. She told herself that pressing him would only make things worse. That space was the kinder option. In hindsight, that moment of hesitation became one of the most painful memories she carried. Romy emphasized that this was not about failing to act heroically. It was about how human instincts prioritize harmony over disruption. Most people, she said, are trained to de-escalate, to soothe, to wait for daylight. Those instincts serve us well most of the time. On that night, they proved tragically insufficient. As the story reached a wider audience, the whisper became a focal point for discussions about emotional responsibility. Commentators debated whether loved ones can ever truly be expected to recognize internal collapse in others. Romy rejected the idea that responsibility could be neatly assigned. She said collapse does not announce itself in ways that fit moral expectations that I in this dramatized account. She spoke about the burden of hindsight. Once an outcome is known, every preceding moment becomes charged with significance. The mind retrofits meaning onto fragments that were once neutral. That process, she said, is unavoidable but dangerous. It can create the illusion that tragedy was obvious all along, when it was not. Romy also addressed the pressure she felt to remember perfectly. Interviews, speculation, and public reaction created an expectation of precision that memory could not satisfy. She said trauma does not preserve moments like a recording. It distorts them, sharpens some edges, blurs others. The whisper, she admitted, might not sound exactly the same if replayed. What remained consistent was how it felt. That feeling, she said, was not fear in the conventional sense. It was a subtle wrongness, an unease without a name. It did not trigger panic. It triggered dismissal. She believed that distinction mattered because it explained why nothing changed afterward. Fear motivates action. Unease is easy to ignore. As experts weighed in, many pointed out that people often expect danger to come wrapped in anger or chaos. When it comes wrapped in calm, it is misread as control. Romy said that insight resonated painfully. Nick did not appear out of control. He appeared composed. That composure, she said, was deceptive in this retelling. She described how the night ended without ceremony. People went to their rooms. Doors closed. Lights dimmed. There was no sense of finality. The whisper did not echo through the house. It disappeared into routine. That disappearance was what allowed everything to proceed unchanged. Romy spoke about the cruelty of ordinary endings. Had the night ended in an argument or confrontation, the whisper might have stood out. Instead, it ended quietly. Quiet endings, she said, invite forgetfulness. They signal safety. They lull people into believing that whatever was odd has resolved itself. The story continued to resonate because it challenged a deeply held belief that proximity equals understanding. Romy said, loving someone does not grant access to their inner world. People can live side by side while carrying completely separate realities. The whisper was a brief overlap between those realities, fleeting and fragile. She also reflected on how language fails in moments like these. Words are often too blunt or too vague to carry what people are trying to express. The whisper may have been an attempt to articulate something that could not be fully formed. That possibility haunted her more than any specific interpretation. She closed this part of the account. Romy returned to the same idea that had followed her since that night. The most dangerous moments are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the ones that feel almost invisible, the ones that blend in, the ones that seem too small to matter until everything else falls apart. The world reacted because the story stripped away comforting assumptions. It showed how easily concern can be postponed, how readily unease can be rationalized, and how devastating that combination can become. The whisper was not terrifying because of what it said, but because of how easily it was absorbed into normalcy. In the end, Romy said, the lesson was not about predicting tragedy. It was about listening more carefully when something feels slightly off, even if there is no clear reason to be afraid. Not every whisper leads to disaster, but every disaster, she said, leaves behind whispers that once went unheard. The account continued. Romy shifted from memory into reflection, trying to explain how a single quiet moment could expand into something that reshaped her entire understanding of family, intuition, and responsibility. In this dramatized narrative, she said the whisper followed her not as sound, but as atmosphere. It lingered in how she interpreted silence afterward, how she heard pauses in conversation, how she weighed calmness against concern. She described how, after the tragedy, ordinary interactions became loaded with meaning. A delayed response, a distracted look, a brief withdrawal, all began to feel heavier than they once had. Romy said this was one of the cruel aftereffects of trauma. It rewires perception, making the mind search constantly for patterns it failed to recognize before. The whisper became the axis around which that search revolved. In recounting this stage, she emphasized that memory is not static. It evolves alongside understanding. The whisper did not grow louder over time, but it grew clearer in context. What once sounded like exhaustion began to sound like finality. What once felt ambiguous began to feel directional. That shift, she said, was not proof of hidden meaning, but proof of how outcome reshapes interpretation. Romy also spoke about the weight of being asked to explain something that may never be fully explainable. Journalists, commentators, and even acquaintances wanted the whisper to carry answers. They wanted it to reveal motive, intent, or inevitability. She said that expectation felt unfair, not only to her, but to the truth. The whisper did not contain a roadmap. It contained uncertainty that in this dramatized telling. She explained that part of her wanted to reject the entire idea of significance. She wanted to believe it was coincidence, a random fragment elevated by tragedy. But another part of her recognized that dismissing it entirely would be dishonest. The whisper mattered, she said, not because it predicted what happened, but because it revealed how easily warning signs can hide inside normal behavior. She reflected on how society teaches people to respect boundaries, to give space, to avoid prying, to trust that others will speak clearly when they need help. Those teachings, she said, are well-intentioned but incomplete. They do not prepare people for moments when distress is communicated indirectly, when a signal is quiet and unclear. Experts who engaged with the story pointed out that many people in emotional crisis struggle to articulate what they are experiencing. They may speak in fragments, metaphors, or incomplete thoughts. These are not always cries for help in the traditional sense. Sometimes they are attempts to externalize something internal without fully confronting it. The whisper, in that context, became an example of how communication can fail even when words are exchanged. Romy said she often wondered what would have happened if she had responded differently. Not dramatically, not with confrontation, but with curiosity. A simple question, a pause, a willingness to sit in discomfort a little longer. She was careful to say this wondering was not an accusation against herself. It was an exploration of how small choices accumulate meaning only after the fact. In this narrative, she spoke about the danger of binary thinking, the idea that moments are either critical or irrelevant. In reality, she said, many moments exist in a gray zone. They do not demand action, but they invite attention. The whisper lived in that gray zone. It did not force a decision. It offered an opening that went unnoticed as the story reached more people. It sparked conversations about emotional literacy, about learning to recognize not just overt distress, but subtle disengagement, about asking questions that feel awkward rather than waiting for certainty. Romy said she hoped the story would encourage gentler vigilance, not fear-driven suspicion. She also addressed the misconception that love guarantees insight. Loving someone deeply does not mean you can see everything they are carrying. Sometimes love makes it harder to see because it filters perception through hope. The whisper pierced that hope briefly, then vanished. That fleetingness, she said, was part of its powered in this dramatized account. Romy described how she eventually stopped trying to decode the exact words and began focusing on the feeling they left behind. That feeling, she said, was one of disconnection, not from her, but from the world. A sense that Nick was already withdrawing from shared reality, even while standing in the same room. She emphasized that this withdrawal was not dramatic. It did not look like despair or anger. It looked like quiet resignation. That subtlety made it easy to misread. People are taught to respond to intensity, not absence. The whisper was defined by absence. Absence of clarity, absence of urgency, absence of demand. As she concluded this section of her account, Romy returned to a theme that had emerged repeatedly. The most unsettling truths are often the quiet ones. They do not insist on being heard. They wait, and if they're not acknowledged, they pass, leaving behind a trail of questions that can never be fully answered. The power of the whisper, she said, was not in what it revealed, but in what it concealed. It concealed how fragile certainty can be, how easily normalcy can absorb unease, how quickly silence can become dangerous when it is misunderstood as peace. For many who heard the story, that realization lingered. It did not provoke panic. It provoked reflection. Reflection on moments they had dismissed, on silences they had respected, on whispers they had chosen not to hear. As the narrative progressed, Romy began to speak about the long aftermath, the way that one quiet exchange continued to unfold long after the night itself had ended. In this dramatized account, she said the whisper did not fade with time. Instead, it changed shape. At first, it felt like a question she could not answer. Later, it became a lens through which she re-examined her understanding of closeness, responsibility, and the limits of intuition. She described how grief reorganizes memory. Events do not line up neatly. They overlap, intrude, and return without warning. The whisper would surface during unrelated moments, when she was cooking, walking, or sitting in silence. It did not arrive with images of violence. It arrived with a feeling of almost connection, the sense that something had been offered but not fully received that I end this retelling. Romy emphasized that what haunted her was not the idea that she could have prevented what happened. She rejected that burden. What haunted her was the realization that she had been present at a threshold without recognizing it. The whisper marked a crossing point, not because it was dramatic, but because it was transitional. It belonged to neither crisis nor calm. It existed between. She reflected on how society often treats emotional ambiguity as something to resolve quickly. People prefer clarity. They want statements to be complete, feelings to be explicit, intentions to be obvious. When something arrives unfinished, it is often set aside. The whisper was unfinished. It asked nothing. It demanded nothing. That made it easy to ignore. Romy also spoke about the pressure to translate personal memory into public meaning. Once the story became known, people wanted it to function as a lesson, a warning, a sign. She struggled with that expectation. She said the truth was more uncomfortable. The whisper did not instruct. It unsettled. It did not tell anyone what to do. It revealed how easily people rely on certainty to guide action. I end this dramatized narrative. She described conversations with friends and professionals who encouraged her to separate hindsight from responsibility. They reminded her that recognition often follows consequence, not the other way around. Understanding this intellectually did not erase the emotional weight, but it helped her place it in context. The whisper mattered, but it was not a verdict. She also addressed the way trauma reshapes empathy. Afterward, she found herself listening differently to people. Pauses stood out. Flatness in tone caught her attention, not because she assumed danger, but because she recognized how much can hide beneath calm surfaces. She said the whisper changed how she listened to silence. Experts who commented on the story noted that such experiences often lead to heightened sensitivity. The challenge, they said, is learning to balance awareness with trust, curiosity with restraint. Romy echoed that sentiment. She said the goal was not to treat every quiet moment as a warning, but to remain open to asking gentle questions when something feels misaligned. She spoke about the difference between intrusion and care. In many families, questioning emotional states feels invasive. Respect is often equated with distance. Romy said the whisper forced her to reconsider that equation. Sometimes, care requires discomfort. Sometimes, it requires staying present in uncertainty rather than retreating into assumptions that I end this account. She described how she eventually stopped trying to interpret the whisper as a message and began seeing it as a mirror. It reflected how easily people accept surface normalcy, how quickly they move past moments that do not fit familiar categories, how reluctant they are to pause when there is no clear instruction to do so. The public response continued to evolve as this perspective spread. The story shifted from shock to contemplation. People were no longer asking what the whisper meant. They were asking how many similar moments they had overlooked, how often they had chosen convenience over curiosity, how frequently they had trusted calm without question. Romy said she hoped the story would not be used to assign blame or create fear. She hoped it would encourage patience with complexity, an understanding that not every warning is loud, that not every danger announces itself, that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that feel almost ordinary. She also acknowledged the limits of narrative itself. No retelling, she said, could fully capture the texture of that night. Words flatten experience. They impose order on something that was inherently ambiguous. The whisper resisted that order. It remained unresolved. Even in retelling A.S., she reflected on the passage of time. Romy said the whisper had become less painful, but no less significant. It no longer replayed with sharpness. It replayed with steadiness. It had become part of how she understood loss, not as a single event, but as a series of moments that gain meaning only in retrospect. She concluded this portion of the narrative with a quiet acknowledgement. The whisper did not explain the tragedy. It did not predict it. It did not prevent it. What it did was expose a vulnerability shared by everyone. The vulnerability of trusting normalcy. The vulnerability of assuming clarity will arrive when it is needed. For those listening, that realization lingered. It did not offer comfort. It offered awareness. Awareness that sometimes the most important signals are the ones that do not insist on being heard. As the narrative moved closer to its end, Romy began to speak about acceptance, not as forgiveness or closure, but as a gradual settling into reality. In this dramatized account, she said there came a moment when she realized the whisper would never resolve into a clean explanation. It would never crystallize into something definitive. Instead, it would remain what it had always been, a fragment, suspended between intention and interpretation. She described how the mind longs for finality after loss. People want a sentence that explains everything, a moment that clarifies cause and effect. When that sentence does not exist, the mind keeps searching. The whisper tempted that search. It felt close enough to meaning to chase, yet distant enough to evade certainty. Accepting that tension, Romy said, was one of the hardest things she had ever done to end this retelling. She spoke about how grief evolves. Early on, it is sharp and consuming. Later, it becomes quieter, more reflective. The whisper followed that trajectory. It stopped feeling like an accusation and started feeling like a reminder. A reminder of how fragile understanding can be, and how much of life operates in spaces that defy explanation. Romy said she eventually stopped asking what the whisper meant and began asking what it revealed about listening. Listening not just to words, but to tone, presence, and absence. Listening to what is not being said. That shift, she said, did not come naturally. It came through exhaustion, reflection, and the slow work of living with unanswered questions. She also reflected on the responsibility of telling the story at all. Sharing the whisper felt like exposing something private, something that belonged to a moment that was never meant to be public. Yet she chose to share it because she believed its power lay not in its specificity, but in its familiarity. Many people, she said, have experienced moments that felt slightly off and chose to move past them. In this account, Romy emphasized that the goal was not to create vigilance rooted in fear. She did not want people to live suspiciously, dissecting every quiet interaction. Instead, she hoped the story would encourage gentleness paired with attentiveness, a willingness to ask questions without accusation, a readiness to stay present when something feels unfinished. She spoke about how the whisper changed her relationship with silence. Silence no longer felt neutral. It felt expressive. It carried potential meaning. That did not make silence dangerous, but it made it deserving of attention. She said she learned to treat quiet moments as opportunities to check in rather than spaces to retreat from. As the story continued to circulate, people began responding with their own experiences. They shared moments they had ignored, comments they had dismissed, feelings they had minimized. The whisper became a shared reference point, a way of articulating something many people had felt but never named. It connected strangers through recognition rather than fear. Romy acknowledged that this recognition came with discomfort. It forced people to confront the limits of intuition and the ease with which normalcy absorbs warning signs. But she believed that discomfort was productive. It opened space for conversation, for awareness, for small shifts in how people respond to one another. In this dramatized narrative, she spoke about the difference between blame and responsibility. Blame seeks a target. Responsibility seeks understanding. The whisper, she said, did not assign blame. It invited responsibility in the broader sense. Responsibility to listen, to notice, to care even when care feels awkward or unnecessary. She also addressed the idea of inevitability. Some people framed the whisper as proof that what happened was destined. Romy rejected that framing. She said inevitability is a comforting illusion. It suggests that outcomes are fixed and therefore less painful. The truth, she said, is more unsettling. Many outcomes are contingent, shaped by countless small moments that do not announce their importance. The whisper was one of those moments. It mattered not because it determined the future, but because it revealed how the future can hinge on moments that feel insignificant at the time. That realization did not offer solace. It offered humility, the humility of knowing how much remains beyond prediction. Yes, she drew this part of the story to a close. Romy returned to the image of that night, the quiet, the familiarity, the sense that nothing was about to change. That memory, she said, would always coexist with what followed. Before and after would never fully separate. They would remain layered, overlapping in her understanding. She concluded with a thought that resonated deeply with those listening. Life, she said, is not divided into clear warnings and clear outcomes. It unfolds in gradients. Whispers exist in those gradients. They are easy to miss because they do not demand attention, but they are part of how people communicate distress when they do not know how to speak plainly. The story did not end with resolution. It ended with awareness. Awareness that listening is an act of practice. Awareness that care sometimes means lingering a little longer in uncertainty. Awareness that silence is not empty. For many, that awareness lingered long after the words were finished. It did not provide answers. It changed how questions were asked. As the final phase of the story unfolded, Romy spoke about how time reshapes meaning without ever fully dissolving it. In this dramatized account, she said the whisper no longer arrived with urgency or pain, but with a quiet persistence, like a note held in the background of song that never quite ends. It had become part of how she understood memory itself, not as a fixed record, but as something that breathes and shifts as understanding deepens. She described how, over time, the human mind seeks balance. It looks for ways to live alongside what cannot be changed. The whisper became one of those companions, not a source of constant distress, but a reminder that life does not always signal its turning points clearly. Romy said she learned to stop demanding answers from it and began allowing it to exist without resolution. I end this retelling. She reflected on how people often confuse peace with certainty. They believe that if something feels calm, it must be safe. The whisper disrupted that belief, not by proving danger, but by revealing how calm can coexist with profound internal struggle. That realization, she said, changed how she interpreted quiet moments, not with fear, but with curiosity. Romy also spoke about the responsibility of storytelling. Once a personal moment becomes public, it takes on a life of its own. People interpret it through their own experiences, fears, and hopes. She said she accepted that reality, even though it meant losing control over how the whisper would be understood. What mattered to her was not precision, but honesty about uncertainty. She emphasized that the story was never meant to elevate one moment above all others. It was meant to show how easily meaning is assigned after the fact. The whisper did not cause what happened. It did not explain it. It simply existed in proximity to it. That proximity made it powerful, but it did not make it prophetic. In this narrative, Romy spoke about learning to sit with ambiguity. In a world that values clarity and decisive answers, ambiguity feels uncomfortable. Yet much of human experience lives there. The whisper belonged to that space. It was not a warning siren. It was a signal that only became visible when the surrounding landscape changed. She reflected on how this understanding altered her relationship with others. She became more patient with incomplete thoughts, more attentive to pauses, more willing to ask gentle questions rather than waiting for certainty. She said the whisper taught her that care does not always look like intervention. Sometimes it looks like presence. As the story reached its later audience, many people responded not with fear, but with recognition. They recognized moments in their own lives that had felt slightly off, comments that lingered without explanation, silences that carried more weight than words. The whisper became a shared metaphor for those experiences, a way of articulating something many had felt but never named. Romy acknowledged that this recognition could be unsettling. It forces people to confront the limits of control and foresight. But she believed that discomfort could lead to growth. Not growth rooted in vigilance or suspicion, but growth rooted in empathy and attentiveness. In this dramatized account, she spoke about the difference between listening to respond and listening to understand. The whisper, she said, revealed how often people listen for clarity rather than for connection. When clarity does not arrive, they move on. Understanding, however, requires staying present even when meaning remains incomplete. She also addressed the temptation to search for moral lessons in tragedy. People want to believe that if they learn the right lesson, similar pain can be avoided. Romy said that while awareness matters, it does not guarantee safety. The goal is not to eliminate risk, but to reduce isolation. To make it easier for people to speak, even when they do not have the words out. As she neared the end of her account, Romy spoke about how she now views that night. It no longer exists as a single moment, but as part of a continuum. Before, during, and after no longer separate categories. They bleed into one another, shaping how she understands time, memory, and connection. She said the whisper ultimately taught her humility. The humility of knowing that people can stand inches apart while worlds away from each other internally. The humility of recognizing that understanding another person is always partial. And the humility of accepting that some questions remain open, not because they were ignored, but because they cannot be fully answered. For those who listened, the story did not end with fear. It ended with attentiveness. Attentiveness to tone. Attentiveness to silence. Attentiveness to the moments that feel almost ordinary. The whisper became a reminder that ordinary moments can carry extraordinary weight, even when they do not announce it. Romy concluded this section with a quiet reflection. She said that if there was one thing she hoped people would take away, it was not suspicion or regret, but presence. The willingness to stay a little longer in conversations that feel unfinished. The courage to ask gentle questions without certainty. The understanding that care often begins where clarity ends. The story did not close a chapter. It opened a way of listening, and that, she believed, was its true meaning. As the story reached its closing moments, Romy spoke with a steadiness that suggested acceptance rather than resolution. In this dramatized account, she said the whisper no longer felt like a question she needed to answer, but like a reminder she carried with her. It reminded her that life often moves quietly at its most critical points, that change does not always arrive with drama, and that understanding is often delayed until after consequences unfold. She reflected on how the human instinct is to search for meaning that feels proportional to loss. When a loss is immense, people expect a cause that is equally clear and forceful. The whisper challenged that instinct. It was small, ambiguous, and easily overlooked. Yet its significance grew not because of what it contained, but because of what followed. That imbalance, she said, is what makes such moments difficult to live with. Romy acknowledged that many people wanted the story to end with certainty. They wanted the whisper to resolve into a lesson that could be neatly applied. She said she could not offer that. What she could offer was honesty about uncertainty. The truth, she said, is that some moments matter only because of where they sit in time, not because of what they clearly express. In this final reflection, She spoke about learning to forgive herself for being human, for responding with normal instincts in an abnormal situation, for choosing calm over confrontation, for trusting routine. She said self-forgiveness did not erase grief, but it allowed her to live without being consumed by hindsight. She also spoke about how the whisper changed her understanding of connection. Connection, she said, is not proven by knowing everything about someone, is proven by willingness to listen, even when meaning is unclear. The whisper did not break that connection. It revealed its limits. The narrative closed. Romy emphasized that the story was never meant to frighten people into constant vigilance. It was meant to invite gentler awareness, a reminder that asking an extra question, staying present a moment longer, or acknowledging unease does not require certainty. It requires care. She ended with a thought that lingered long after the words were spoken. Life, she said, is filled with whispers. Most of them lead nowhere. Some of them fade without consequence. But a few remain, not because they predicted the future, but because they remind us how fragile understanding can be. The power of the whisper was not in its volume, but in its timing. It existed at the edge of change, unnoticed until everything else shifted. That realization did not offer answers. It offered perspective, and with that perspective came a quiet invitation to listen a little more carefully, to stay present a little longer, to accept that clarity is not always immediate, and that care often begins in moments that feel almost ordinary.